Hi. So, I love to teach permaculture through a lot of different lenses and a lot of different real world examples. And over, I mean, it kind of comes back to the same themes, right? So each thing we teach about it kind of points back to the same basic truths or approaches to working with nature and working with life. And one of those really important approaches is to really question anytime we have to buy something or use some, intense resource in order to accomplish something simple that's working with life. So what do I mean by this, right? Like, a lot of times, I mean, more times than I can count, I've encountered people saying things about how I'm going to grow food or how I'm going to build something and saying, you can't do that without X. In other words, you can't possibly build that without this chemical product you buy from Home Depot, or you can't, you just can't get away with it, right? Or you can't possibly grow food without all these fertilizers and chemicals and herbicides, especially, I mean, you can't grow trees without herbicides or fungicides. Like, it's a really common one to hear, sadly, which, if you just apply a little bit of common sense to it for a moment, discounts, well, say most of human history, like the vast majority, where none of these chemical products were available, right? I mean, at least the way I heard it told with like a lot of like herbicide, fungicide kind of stuff. Somebody at some point figured out you could use like lead paint on your crops in the 1800s, and there we go, and the whole thing began, right? Poisons in order to grow food. If that was really true that you had to do that, then what did our ancestors do, right? And, what do people do in all the communities where they still can't do that stuff, maybe because they can't afford or access those poisonous products, those chemical products, right? People find a way to live and grow food and build. So the idea that you have to do this stuff, let's take that off the table immediately because it's just not true, right? Um, so going to like a real world example that comes up for me a bunch is like around irrigation, right? Like the idea that you need irrigation systems to grow crops. So right now, as far as I've, researched it, like crop land, right? Like agricultural land on the industrial scale, something like 20% of that globally, and I think it's something like 15% in America and the United States is irrigated, right? So most of our food is coming from is not currently irrigated in any way. But when we get down to our gardens, or our orchards, people are often installing or thinking they have to install irrigation systems. And a lot of our food, are like for our CSAs and farmers market kind of things, are grown in season extension situations with like plastic polytunnels, different things that will cause, to be able to grow stuff maybe earlier or later than you would otherwise, with, of course, the fact that then they would be excluded from the rainwater, right? They would actually need a water source within them or to be watered in some way, right? Because they're not getting the rain. So I want to talk about, this is kind of where a lot of interesting things come together in permaculture, right? One is this general, I mean, for me, a part of what brought me into it is that I don't like the idea of having to take resources from far away or non-renewable resources in order to meet my basic needs, right? And of course I do sometimes in practice, but I don't like having to do that and I want to do that less. So water, right? Water seems like a really renewable resource. Unless you're looking at things like Lake Mead dropping every year, like people questioning whether there's going to be water in the Colorado River that's available for all the different places it provides water for, right? These are like there are water crises all around. They're not in the same ways hitting the hot and humid southeast where I tend to live and learn this stuff, but water crises are real, right? But a more close to home water crisis that I encountered, I think it was back in 2010, was we were considering when I first moved onto land in rural North Carolina, do we get a well, or do we have another option, right? For that, because pretty much everybody gets a well, like that's the obvious thing, right? But one thing I encountered in that research is that the wells were having to be dug deeper and deeper all the time. And in around 2010, the county I was in did a presentation to the like for the county basically about how many wells had to be dug another 50 to 100 foot beyond what they already had been. In other words, a lot of wells were failing. There's a large percentage of wells that were failing and needing to be dug deeper. So what's happening there? Why are wells needing to be dug deeper, right? And this renewable resource of water, even in this very rainfall heavy climate, is going down, 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 right? And so we're not accessing the top layers of, rainfall and groundwater and the water table up here. We're actually accessing this deep, deep water source, right? That's sort of to me, it's a precious generational source of wealth. It's a store to help support life that's really should only be accessed in times of great need. But standard irrigation practices and standard building practices and all of it is we dig the deepest well we need to get a certain amount of gallons per minute, and that's what we do, right? So this, so thinking of our wells and our city water as a renewable resource is would be technically true if our recharge rate was such that we were slowly replenishing these generational reservoirs, but we're not, clearly, as evidenced by both the big, reservoirs going down, things like Lake Mead, but also by the wells being dug deeper and deeper, even in a place where water is abundant. So this should give us a lot of concern, right? I mean, this is the strategy we rely on for something as mundane and pointless as a lawn, and something as vital as our food, in many cases, our gardens for sure, right? Our households. I mean, we're not living within what I learned from Brad Lancaster as like the rain budget of the land, right? This very useful phrase that there's actually an amount of rainfall, and if you live in the Southeast, a lot of it, fortunately, a whole lot of it, that's coming to us. That's kind of like our budget that we can design around. How can we live within the amount of rain that the land gives us naturally per year, right? Rather than having to draw from like the savings account, to use a capitalist metaphor, right? The deep reserves that are meant to be for a difficult day. We're drawing from that as our everyday use of water. And then I could go on and on about that. Water's kind of running off the surface and blah, 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 but I won't do that, right? That's not where we're going with this. What I really want to talk about is how, like, so I can come at it from this value, right? I don't want to use that resource anymore, that generational resource. But then it can take me to these other really interesting places, which it turns out that like a lot of things in permaculture, the sort of natural, which just means like the way, like the natural way was the way, and it will be in the future the way. It's only right now that we have this stuff to waste, right? Cheap oil, and although it's getting less cheap these days, and access to super deep water through deep wells that are more and more expensive, and so on, right? But if we didn't have that, like we probably won't one day, I don't expect, my great great grandchildren to have access to that stuff. And like our ancestors didn't have that, what do? Well, you rely on rainwater, right? Especially if you're in the Southeast. In some cultures, you do rely on rainwater, and you create these really clever irrigation systems, right? We're finding these all over the world. There are systems that supplement this, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, depending on how they're designed. But you rely on this rainwater, and you rely on the springs, which are recharged by the rainwater, and you rely on the groundwater and the water table and the things that are accessible without giant machinery and irrigation equipment. And what's interesting about that is that there are qualities to relying on the rainwater that are actually beneficial beyond what we get with relying on irrigation and deep well water, right? And so it's another kind of the brilliance that permaculture points us to, which is in this case really is just the same brilliance that our ancestors and indigenous cultures always had, but permaculture shining this light on it of like, look, really, there's a lot of reasons to not do things the way we're doing it. The brilliance of rainwater is that it actually has a lot of things that plants need that we're not getting in the same way from deep well water often. We're not getting from irrigation systems often. And so what do I mean by that, right? So rainwater, it picks up a lot of things as it falls from the atmosphere that it's then depositing into the plants. And one of those things is a very bioavailable form of nitrogen, right? Which I believe are nitrates. I'm not a chemist. Nitrate. I think it's a nitrate. Okay, but yeah, a very bioavailable form of nitrogen. I've heard it's the same form that maybe lightning strikes had made available as part of the formation of the early Earth ecosystems and throughout, right? It's so, not to go all the way into the nitrogen topic, but like nitrogen, there's more than enough for everything on Earth. It's a super abundant resource, except that the plant available forms of it are a little more scarce. And so any plant available forms of it are a special thing that life has learned to work with, that it, pretty much relies on for, plants pretty much rely on for a regularity of growth, right? And one of those really key sources of that nitrogen is rainwater, right? Another thing, though, that's really interesting about rainwater to me is the way that, like, so, okay, we think of plants need water, right? And we think of water as this, like, input. This is our mechanical thinking society, right? You need a certain amount of this level of this thing to do this thing, right? So if I have more water, this thing happens. If I have too much, this other thing happens. Plant needs 10 units of water, right? This is like how we're taught to think in our culture, right? Um, but rainwater is not this isolated event that's just like a unit of water being deposited in a plant that gives the plant a little smiley face in a video game and the meter goes up or whatever. Like, that's how irrigation systems are thinking of it because it's my plant needs X amount of water. I don't want to give it more water than it needs because that costs money. I don't want to give it less because the growth goes down. It's this optimization mindset, right? That's the whole epitome of where I think we've gone way wrong as a culture. But rainwater also comes with what? Well, clouds and weather, right? And a change in atmospheric pressure and a change in humidity, right? And sometimes those beautiful little breezes that come before that bring in the rainstorm, right? And there's all kinds of different rains. And the way that the rains and the atmosphere and the humidity and the cloud cover and all these things work together is a whole phenomenon. It's not an isolated here's some water units for your plant. It's an orchestration. It's a whole being by itself. It's a phenomenon we call rain, right? I mean, that rain is so sacred and amazing is something that anybody who's actually stood in the rain or played in the rain or waited for the rain to come could tell you. Any child knows this. Like, my daughter loves puddles that are made of rain because they're amazing. And when it's raining, that's a great time to play outside. Like, if the child in you remembers this stuff, hopefully. But when it comes to growing our plants, we often think we have to encase them in these plastic tunnels and then feed these tubes, full of things that can fail and that'll, be environmental junk later and that costs money, right? And that are shipped from factories we would never want to visit and so on, in order to get plants to grow. But actually, when we do that, when we water these plants on this schedule and we think about this number, we're missing all the, I hope I'm using this big word right. I remember a lot of words from school and I don't remember, but do I really know what they mean? The epiphenomena, right? I'm going to use that word. I think that's a cool word, epiphenomena. What I imagine this means is all the things that happen around the phenomena. So all the things that happen around the event of rainfall are all also part of the plant using that rain for the best of its growth, right? So that includes the atmospheric things that it's catching along the way, nitrogen and some other minerals and things like that are going there. It also includes the way the plants respond to this interesting blend of cloud cover and humidity, right? Because the plants are alive, they're not machines. And there's all these little pores, the stomata that open differently in those situations, right? And the soil itself, which is alive, hopefully, is responding differently. I mean, we've all seen the earthworms come up towards the rain. How is that affecting the ability for rain to infiltrate into those little pores that they leave in their tunnels as they seek the water, right? And this Sepp Holzer, this permaculture mystic from Austria, like a lot of permaculture mystics, who knows how he knows half the stuff he says, and who knows if it's true. I tend to believe it. But he says that the soil itself responds to the conditions that bring these rains, where it actually opens itself, and makes a place for the rain to infiltrate more deeply. Now, I've not been able to find any kind of like scientific explanation of that, and I don't tend to worry about it too much. And, I tend to think like that definitely could be true. Well, why could that be true? Because all life on earth is wise and works together. And why wouldn't the soil have a way of working with the rain and the plants have a way of working with the soil? It tends to be true, right? But all these things come together, and could there be some greater rhythm to the way that the plants know the cycle of when the rains are coming, right? There are all these things, all these phenomena that indigenous folks have learned, that country people have learned, where farmers used to know before they got all industrial and detached from the earth. Of there'll be things that happen before a rain. Like, I noticed that if the frogs started singing on a certain day, that was a pretty sure sign that that drought was going to end and the rain really was coming. And somehow they knew the difference between all these fake out rains where it was forecast, and then I'd watch the forecast go from 4 days of rain to 3 days of rain to 2 days of rain to no rain, and cry a little bit inside, um, if it wasn't too dry to cry, which it sometimes felt like it was. But the frogs knew when that drought was going to end. They would start going and singing. And the birds would get all excited, like they are before and after a rain, and there'd be some kind of change in the air. There are all these things changing in the phenomenon of rain. So why wouldn't we expect the perfect delivery of water to be the delivery of water that evolved with the plants, that plants have always relied on, right? And I understand why people irrigate. I mean, I water my garden sometimes, don't get me wrong. Like, I think it's possible. I know it's possible. And I've done it some to grow food with, little to no extra watering, like almost none. If we rely on the right plants and heavy mulch and they get established and we have some luck with the rainwater and our soil organic matter content is high because the amount of water that high carbon soil and high organic matter soil can hold, versus low is very, very different. So there's all these things that help that, right? And I also think about, rainwater's rhythm, which is not at our command, right? That there's times of a lot of rain and times of little rain is also part of the cycle of what builds good soil and strong plants and healthy plants, right? Thinking about the difference between there's, this many milliliters of rain every day from an irrigation or water every day from an irrigation system, this boring kind of industrial approach. Oh, sorry, there's a loud noise just then. It's yep, someone's cutting stuff for building. Okay, so yeah, right. The difference between okay, the same amount of water every day. Monday this much, Tuesday this much, Wednesday this much, Thursday. Boring, consistent. Grows plants. Clearly, people do that a lot. It works. It gets us something, right? From those deep wells, from these increasingly scarce sources with all this expensive equipment that can break down and be in landfills. On the other hand, what we have with nature is we have cycles of sometimes like, yeah, evenly distributed, okay, an inch of rain a week, that kind of vibe happens. But then we also get these really intense rain events that flood and saturate the soil temporarily, right? I don't mean like floods, although that's a thing too. I just mean heavy rains, like 3 days in a row of heavy rain, a lot of cloud cover, right? So what happens is the soil gets saturated with water, and then a lot of those little rootlets and questing kind of searching roots of the plants, they die. They get too soaked, and depending on the kind of plant, they actually die off, right? What happens when roots die in the soil? They feed life. It's a good thing. They open up pores, right? They open up air spaces naturally, and then things go and eat the little things they left, and they leave all these mineral deposits in an interesting way, and you get this textured, dendritic, fractal kind of soil with all these interesting things happening in them, right? On the other hand, you then get that dry week, right? Or that dry 10 days. And if you have healthy plants that are supported in the way they need with good organic matter and good mulch on top, those plant roots, what they do is they start questing deeper and deeper and farther for water, right? And they're opening the soil up and they're connecting to life. But even more than that, they start to form deeper and deeper partnerships with fungal life. And in order to partner with fungal life, they have to feed fungal life and make it a good place for fungi to be. So they have to give something back to the fungus. And so the dry periods, as much as the wet periods, are essential in creating these webs of interconnected life that then become the intelligence of the garden, the intelligence of the forest. I mean, the way that a forest and a garden can defend themselves against imbalances of insects or imbalances of, humidity that cause disease pressures or whatever it is, the immune system basically of the healthy garden and the healthy forest come from this fungal interweaving between the plants, right? I mean, it's not just our forest plants that need these fungal relationships, right? I've grown fantastic vegetables in a very fungal garden bed. I've heard it said that, there's bacterial soils are for garden plants, fungal soils are for forest plants and perennials. Not necessarily the case. I've seen some crazy plants growing annuals in some really fungal soils because they all partner with these fungi too, right? So anyway, that's all to say that we want those dry periods and we want those wet periods, just like, back to like a human life, right? Like for our lives, we want periods where there's a lot of stress that's causing us to go deeper into our reservoirs of ourself and to make relationships, to make like the fungi, to connect with other people, to ask for help, to learn from somebody else, to lean on deep reservoirs of connection and find the deep waters of ourselves. We also want periods where we just have things, a lot of water coming, and it's so much, and maybe we just like it's so much interestingness and goodness happening that we have to let go of parts of ourselves and give things away, like give away our rootlets, or let go of that path of that questing rootlet that went over there and drowned out. We don't need it anymore, and just take the easy water that comes. We need both, right? What we don't need is a sort of factory model of this very boring, here's the same amount of interesting life every day, like 2 milliliters of interesting human life, 2 milliliters of support per day, dripped out, drip, 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 right? Not so good for the soul, not so good for the deepening of human beings, right? And not something that we evolved with, and not something that we'll have in the future, right? So going back to the rainwater, rainwater also has a naturally, not talking about urban situations where there's maybe a lot of pollution and smog, but in most conditions, rainwater has a naturally slightly acidic balance, which for most of our garden plants, that's what they prefer, right? Rainwater is also biologically active. So I still remember the first time I read, I think it was an account in Stephen Herod Buhner's book, what's it, the intelligence of plants and the Wild Dream. Oh gosh, it's one of those 20-word titles. Yeah, that you'll find it if you're meant to find it. It's so look up Stephen Buhner and the intelligence of plants. Anyway, he writes this description of the way that that bacteria seed the clouds, and bacteria that are safe on the ocean, that can live on the ocean, right? And that are warmed then by the sun hitting the ocean and driven up into the atmosphere and are so light they ride on these thermal currents. And then they get up there and the little dust that they are is the nuclei of cloud formation, right? And those bacteria have a relationship to the forests, and the forests can like the presence of forests and trees can help release the pollen and things that in the bacteria that fly on them into the sky and call in the rain that helps feed the trees. And so, in other words, there's bacteria in everything. There's bacteria in the atmosphere. There's all this invisible stuff happening. So, that bacteria, that atmospheric bacteria, that probably is bacteria that I would guess has a very special relationship to rain and cloud cover and plants and all of it, and is probably intimately connected in the plant to the plants in a way that we have trouble understanding or observing, is part of that rainwater experience, is part of what's coming down, right, into those plants, right? And if you've ever seen too the lush deep green of plants in a rain situation, it's not just a refraction of light from the clouds, as I used to think. It's actually a nitrogen mobilization in the plants leaves, is what I've heard. They sort of get excited and get ready to photosynthesize and open their pores, and there's a deep green, and maybe one of the most beautiful phenomenon of Earth, like something I wish I could just look at forever, is the color of happy plant leaves in a healthy rain. That emerald, like that verdant color, is just, it feeds me at a very deep level. And that's not what you're going to get inside a plastic tunnel with an irrigation system. So you can install an irrigation system, and you're going to spend a lot of money, and you're going to use a non-renewable, multiple non-renewable resources, not just the materials that go into that, whether it's plastic and metal and all these things, not just the transport for those things and the complexity of the global supply chain with people working in terrible conditions to give us this cheap stuff, because the economics of irrigation is that it's only really affordable if we have people working for terrible wages, far away, shipping this cheap stuff to us so we can put it and grow our orchards. And it's a whole system, right? It's a whole nefarious system that's all based on that, that's fragile to supply chain changes or fossil fuel changes or any of it. We can do that and create these plants without these deep questing roots and without this intelligence and without this relational quality. They get used to this kind of boring regular life and probably wouldn't know how to survive very well without irrigation, because they don't have those fungal relationships in the same way, and they don't have those deep connections. You know, or we can learn to rely more on rainwater, even if it's just mostly on rainwater, and to trust more in the plant's ability to actually find the water if we give them what they need, right? And then they're getting all these other benefits that we can't even understand or track by ourselves, right? So this is another case where permaculture is saying, like, look, work with nature, but some of working with nature is just understanding what plants evolved for and trusting that there's more going on in those relationships that we just decided weren't good enough and interrupted with all these expensive inputs. um, try to understand that there was something going on in those relationships that was working very well. Like that was not no pun intended with well, sorry, but that was working. That was whole. That was bringing benefits that we have trouble replicating. The most tuned in hydroponic control system with nutrient baths and water and irrigation and all that. I mean, they work, right? You can grow things. You can grow really crazy looking tomatoes, and you can grow crazy looking cannabis and all that stuff with these hydroponic systems. But it's just lacking this resilience of the plants and this connection to nature. And it's another thing that you have to pay for and do and set up and maintain and import. And then when it's done, figure out what landfill, like whose problem it's going to be, right? Which people and which future generations are going to deal with it. So I say, like, learn to work without watering and irrigation as much as possible. Know when the time is to, give plants supplemental water, and give them that water from the rainwater. Catch it, and catch it into rain barrels, catch it into IBC toads, catch it into the land even better, catch it into irrigation ponds and into swales, and use that water that's there when the plants need the extra support. But mostly catch it with the plants and catch it with the soil, and if you need, if you have drying forces like wind, or you have drying forces like excess southern sun, gentle those forces out, like block some of that wind so it doesn't dry out, and block some of that intense western sun so when the ground just really needs a bit of a break. Like remember, sort of hopping topics a little, that we are so used to thinking of everything as needing full sun. And what I've tell people more and more that comes as a bit of a different thing that they've been told is don't go for full sun all the time. Like very few things really want full sun when the full sun comes with a feels like temperature of 101 or like high 90s for weeks at a time. Because that's the plants will often, even warm season plants will often shut down their growth in those conditions and wait for things to chill out a bit. So help them chill out by shading some of that, by shading some of that ground with things that can grow and produce shade and by with mulch and all of it, right? But yeah, rainwater is another teacher of how what nature provides is better than what we can provide. And it's less controlled, it's less regular, it's less predictable, it's harder to monetize, it's harder to create a business plan around or to get loans around. But it's much more whole. And the wholeness of that experience is what actually provided the health for our ancestors, will provide the health for future generations. And every step we take away from that wholeness gives us some temporary relief of something predictable and controllable, but creates a whole bunch of other problems, right? That somebody's going to have to deal with, us or other people or other future generations or all the above. So, yeah, appreciate your rainwater, appreciate what nature already gives. Learn the rain budget of your land. Learn the rainfall amount you catch from your roof. Learn the amount of rain that hits an acre of land that you live with, and learn to live within that. It's more than possible in the Southeast. I've lived without a well twice now, and it seems kind of crazy, and I don't regret it at all. I think I wish I'd set up rain catchment better and earlier in the first land I lived in. The place I'm living now did it right away, and never would look back because a well has to be very deep and very expensive. And if it's very expensive, will we always be able to afford them? Like some of us can't now, and some of us won't be able to in the future, and some of us won't be able to afford digging it deeper when it has to be dug deeper in 20 years. And also, if we rely on it and it fails, that's a major problem. But even beyond the well thing, or the cost thing, I'm taking it from a place that I like shouldn't be able to access. Right? Like in some ways, it's unnatural. It's a limited time human event that I can access that resource. And we've lived through the experiment of seeing what happens when everybody can access that resource, and the results are not good. The jury's in about that. It's we're losing it, right? We're having to go deeper, and we're losing the water. So it ain't working. It's not necessary, and it's not as good anyway. So yeah, before you go and buy a bunch of irrigation stuff, slow it down and think about it. Especially if you're growing trees in an orchard, they need water to establish, but you don't need to irrigate your orchard like that. I mean, come on. Trees know how to grow better than we know how to grow them. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you.